Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Daily Kaylee's 13 Days of Halloween. We are on day number 2, and today's episode is about Gerard Schaefer, who is also known as the Killer Cop, if you have never heard of him. If you hear any, clicking in the background, I am going through my notes because this is such an extensive case for one man and the amount of crimes he was actually charged with. It's insane how much detail they have on him. So if you hear me clicking, I'm going through my notes. I actually had a mishap and I already recorded half of this episode the other day, and it's gone. I don't know what happened. It did not save at all. So here we go. Let's go back through this. Like I said, Gerard Schaefer is his name. He was a cop, and he was born March 26, 1946. Before we talk about the crimes that he committed, I'm going to go through a brief history of his background so you can kind of get the picture of Gerard Schaefer. He was born in Wisconsin. His parents had 3 children, including Gerard, and he was the oldest. They moved around a lot when he was a kid. He did not have a close relationship with his father. His father was very verbally abusive to his wife and his children. They moved around a lot. His father was an alcoholic, so he was not home very often. It was just a really troubled relationship. So he was a lot closer to his mother. As a child, he preferred outdoor activities. Like I said, he had a rough childhood. He did not want to be in his home. He did not really... It's not that he didn't get along with other kids. It's that he didn't really fit in with other kids. He was sort of a loner, so he liked to do things outdoors. He liked to fish, hunt, anything that involved guns. He was super outdoorsy. You know the type. You definitely know the type. In school, like I said, he was kind of a loner. He wasn't your typical loner, though. He wasn't a weird kid that everyone stayed away from and shunned, an outsider. He just, I don't know. He was acquainted with a few kids, but they weren't close. He didn't have any close friends that he hung out with. He didn't have a clique, if that makes sense. A lot of the girls that he went to high school with remember him as being the pervy kid. He dated a few girls, regardless of this, but one of his former classmates, her name is Barbara Krotlick, and she was interviewed about him after all of this happened. But she spoke of him, and she said, "I can't remember him being friends with any of the guys. He was always on the outside looking in. As a matter of fact, the only thing I really remember is that I always had to tuck my skirt under my legs because he would practically stand on his head to look up a girl's skirt." Probably not the best way for girls to remember you, but there you go. He was a peeping Tom in his teenage years. He would cross-dress. Like I said, girls thought he was a perv. He wanted, one thing only. While he was a teenager, he had developed these erotic fantasies of hurting women. As far as we know, he didn't actually hurt any women while he was in high school. However, he would go out into the woods and he would hurt himself. It's kind of hard to explain, but let me paint the picture. He would dress up as a woman. He would wear a women's underwear, and he would tie himself to a tree in the middle of the woods and just sort of pretend that he was watching a woman do this. If you hear a child screaming, my co-host is supposed to be in bed right now, and she's fighting hard. So we will pretend that she is on a nice tropical vacation, and that's why my co-host is not here with us. And we will pretend that we don't hear her fighting bedtime upstairs. Shannon's up there with her. She'll be okay. She's just really excited when I do work. It's so cute. Back to Gerard Schaefer. Let's talk about this intense, crazy, creepy story instead of my sweet child. Like I said, super erotic fantasies. He would dress up as a woman in the middle of the woods, This was all while he was a teenager. All of the girls thought he was creepy, and he didn't really fit in with the guys. His teachers thought he was a promising student. He had good grades, he was a part of the football team, and he was just a good athlete. Like, they thought he would do great things. After he graduated high school, he enrolled at Broward Community College. I hope I'm saying that right. I'm not from Florida, but it's spelled like Broward, so I'm going to say that. He went through college. He was a social studies major at first, and then he decided he wanted to be a teacher. He did not get great grades in college. He kind of just had average grades. But while he was at Broward, his sophomore year, he met another girl, and they both went on to the Florida Atlantic University in Boca Raton after their sophomore year at the community college. In December of 1968, if you heard that, that was my cat, not a human. Anyways, in December of 1968, Gerard married his fiancée, the girl that he met in college. Her name was Martha Louise Fogg, also known as Marty. They got married fairly quickly, and they rented a property together. They moved in very fast. However, they were married for less than 2 years before they divorced. And Marty said the reason that she wanted a divorce is because he was extremely cruel, and he was always demanding sex from her. He also spent a lot of his free time out of the house hunting, doing outdoors activities. So when he wasn't around, he was cruel and he wanted sex from her, and then he would just leave. After this, well, I guess it was right before they got divorced. It was in March of 1969. Gerard applied for a teaching internship, his first of many, as you will see. He began the position on September 23rd, 6 months later, and he was teaching geography, but he was fired on November 7th, a month and a half later, barely, because he was constantly shoving his own beliefs down his students' throats, both like political opinions, moral opinions, things that had absolutely nothing to do with the class, and it was super inappropriate. So, as you can imagine, a lot of parents complained about him. They really had no choice but to remove him because he refused to listen and refused to stop doing it. A few months later, he applied to another student teaching position, did not get it. So 4 months later, which was right before his divorce, in March of 1970, he applied for another teaching internship, and he was accepted. He was once again teaching geography, and his progress reports there showed that he was not doing great. He was performing really badly. All of his superior teachers noted that he was so arrogant, and he had very limited knowledge on the subject that he was teaching, so they had no idea why he was even interested in this topic. He was only there for 7 weeks before the principal of the high school told him that they were withdrawing him from the internship by May 18th. So, like I said, it was 7 weeks, less than 2 months. And after this, he kind of gave up on teaching. This was not for him, obviously, so he was done. After his divorce and after he was terminated from the high school, he vacationed in Europe and North Africa for a little bit before he returned back to Florida. When he returned, he worked briefly as a security guard because he was in that weird place between jobs where he did not know what he wanted to do. However, working as a security guard, he decided, I'm going to be a police officer. Because truly, in a small town, what else is there for him to do at this point? So, on September 1st, 1970, he applies for a vacancy within the Wilton Manors Police Department. He, however, did not disclose the fact that he had been fired from multiple student teaching positions within the past year. And instead, he falsely claimed that he had 2 years' experience as a research assistant at FAU, and that he had recently returned to the U.S. from Morocco, which would fill in the gaps of his employment history. They did not verify his previous work history, so they hired him. They're like, okay, great, he's great. He was formally inducted into the Broward County Police Department the following year in September of 1971, and he graduated as a patrolman at the age of 25 at the end of the year. In January 1971, 7 months before he began his career as a police officer, he met a secretary named Teresa Dean while he was still working as a security guard. She was 19 years old, and they very quickly became engaged, which is not really a shock considering his first marriage. They got married in September of that year, so right after he got hired at the police department. According to Gerard himself, he says that his second marriage was much better than his first. Apparently, his second wife willingly gave in to his demands for sex, and they also did outdoor activities together, so good for them. However, I'm sure the honeymoon phase did not last very long, because within 6 months, he was fired from the police department, so that's a strain already. He was only, I guess, sort of praised in his work once, and it was like a drug bust that went great. He did a good job. However, other than this literally one time, his performance was pretty poor, nothing great, and he was dismissed. They also found out, upon his dismissal, he had a habit of only stopping cars that were driven by females. And when he stopped these cars, it was very minor infractions, like a ridiculous thing to pull them over for. He would then take their license plate numbers, put them in the database to get personal information about them, and then he would call them to ask them on a date. Awful. I'm sure none of these women said yes. I've got to be positive on that. I would never. But this isn't about me, so let's continue. He very quickly found a new job, also in law enforcement, and he became a deputy with the Martin County Sheriff's Department on June 23rd, 1972. He forged a letter of recommendation, and his background check said that he had no criminal record, so he was good to go. The following month, this is when shit goes south, and you're kind of surprised that he's had a clean record up to this point. On the afternoon of July 21st, 1972, Gerard finds 2 teenage hitchhikers while on patrol duty. The first girl is named Nancy Ellen Trotter, who was 18 years old, and her friend was named Paula Sue Wells, who was 17. He picks them up, and he drives them to Stewart in Florida. And he's telling the girls, hey, it's not safe to hitchhike, like, you got off lucky this time because I'm a cop, like, all that bullshit. He learns that neither of them are from Florida, and that they're actually on their way to Jensen Beach, and that's where they're going to be going the following day. So, Gerard is, like, being the nice guy in the situation, like the trusty police officer. And he's like, hey, let me drive you. Since you don't know the area, I'd be willing to drive you there. And they're like, yeah, of course, because they're teenage girls and they just got a free ride to the beach. They are scheduled to meet the following morning at a bandstand on East Ocean Boulevard at 9:15. The following morning, they all show up. They're excited to get to the beach, and he's excited to do creepy things to these girls. This time, he was in his own vehicle, not his police car, and he was wearing just like normal clothes. The girls thought that was a little bit weird, but he said that he was undercover and he was still on duty. So he, as you can imagine. Within minutes of the girls entering his vehicle, he takes like a detour of the route they were supposed to be on. And he says that he's going to show them like at this old Spanish fort since they're not from Florida. While they're on the way to this supposed fort, he once again is like lecturing them, hey, you should not take rides from strangers, it's not safe, you could be sold into slavery and all this shit. And then he stops the car right outside of this dilapidated, like abandoned shed, which is very ominous. They're inside of the forest, and he takes them out of the car, handcuffs them, and gags them. He took one of the girls to a large tree close to the Indian River, and he tied her legs to the trunk just below her knees. He then put a noose around her neck, and he put it on the branch in a way that she had to stand on the tree roots on her tiptoes to keep the pressure of the noose off of her throat. He then took the other girl to a tree nearby and did the exact same thing, that both girls were basically struggling to keep their head far enough off the ground to not hang to death. They were told by Gerard that they were going to be raped and then murdered. At this moment, before he's done anything to the girls, Gerard gets a regular dispatch and says he needs to immediately come to the police station. They need him. He needs to come in. He leaves both of the girls tied to the tree this way and tells them that he'll be soon and not to try to run away because he's not going to be very far away. He also says that the person that contacted him that he's going to meet is a man that he is going to sell them to as slaves. Much to his surprise, when Gerard returned to the forest about 2 hours later, both of the girls were gone. They had escaped. He immediately returned home and he called the station, and he's telling the sheriff, "I've done something very foolish. You'll be mad at me." He then explains that what he was doing this afternoon was he was teaching these two young girls a lesson on hitchhiking and why they should not take rides from random strangers. He then says that he overdid the job. He explained that he had abandoned the two girls in the swamp area of Hutchinson Island, which is not far from the Indian River. The sheriff and the police lieutenant immediately go searching for these girls, and they get to Florida State Road A1A, where they discovered a partially gagged teenage girl with her hands pinned behind her back, desperately swimming and trying to stay above water. As the officers stopped, she noticed them, and then she was desperately trying to get their attention. They helped her out. Sections of her pants and her shirt were completely shredded in her struggle. And when they take the gag out of her mouth, she tells them her name is Nancy, and she's saying that her friend is lost somewhere in the forest. However, Nancy was informed that a truck driver had actually discovered her friend Sue, and she'd already been at the police station for about 45 minutes. So, of course, she was so relieved her friend was safe. They were both safe. They had both escaped. Nancy was driven to the station, and her and Sue were reunited, and they told the sheriff what happened. They both said that they had managed to escape by very gently rubbing their wrist against their restraints to loosen the rope. And then they loosened their gags with their teeth. They also said this had taken so much time because they had to be extremely careful, because if they had slipped, they would have hanged. Both girls provided a very detailed description of both Schaefer and his vehicle, and they formally identified him as the man responsible. Gerard insisted that he had simply overreacted. He was not going to hurt these girls. He was just trying to be like a good guy and keep them safe. And they did not believe him. Neither would I. And he was dismissed immediately from the force and placed under arrest. He was charged with false imprisonment and aggravated assault. That's it. He was not charged with kidnapping, literally anything. But it's a start. 2 weeks after he was arrested, Gerard posted his $15,000 bail, and he was free until his trial in November of 1972. When he got home to the house that him and his wife were renting together, his wife and her family, his in-laws, said there was no change in his behavior. So they did absolutely believe his story. They believed that he was just trying to teach these girls a lesson. While he was out on bail, another incident happened. On September 27th, 1972, Gerard abducted two teenage girls, one by the name of Susan Carol Place, who was 17 years old, and the other by the name of Georgia Marie Jessup, who was 16. The girls had met Gerard while they were at an adult education center in Fort Lauderdale. Gerard introduced himself as Jerry Shepard and said that he was from Colorado and that he was passing through back to Colorado from a trip that he had taken to Mexico. So he was passing through Florida. He gained their trust. He pretended to be interested in the same things as them. I mean, they were young girls. They were happy to be his friend. On the afternoon of their disappearance, Susan's mother, Lucille, arrived home and found what she said was that her daughter was straightening her room, cleaning up, and Georgia sat on a chair in the bedroom. Both of the girls introduced Lucille to this man who seemed to be in his 20s, and they referred to him as Jerry. Susan told her mother that her, Georgia, and Jerry intended to travel to the beach and play guitar. Susan's mother was suspicious, as I would be if I came home and an older man was in my daughter's room and I never met him and suddenly they're leaving together. However, Jerry, aka Gerard, he told Lucille that his intentions were noble, pure, her daughter would be safe with him, they were just going to hang out at the beach. However, like I said, she was still rightfully suspicious as a mother, so she took down the tag number of his car. Susan did indeed leave home with this man. However, she told her mom that she'd be gone for just a little while and that she would remain in contact and she'd be home. Both girls left with Gerard, at around 8:45 p.m. from the Place household. Lucille did not hear from Susan for 4 days, which was very unlike Susan and very suspicious since she had just told her she would stay in touch. Lucille contacted George's mom, Shirley, and Shirley told Lucille that her daughter and Susan had ran away, supposedly, on September 27th, the same day that they were last seen, and that Shirley had not heard from Georgia either. Both of these were very suspicious, very strange, so they reported missing to the Oakland Park Police. Lucille gave investigators the tag number and gave them a description of Gerard. The tag number, however, was traced to an entirely different vehicle, different model, different make, completely different, to a different city. And this car was in St. Petersburg, and it belonged to a man who was no way, shape, or form Gerard Schaefer. He looked nothing like him, and he also had an alibi, so they knew, this was not the man. There was only one registered Jerry Shepard living in Fort Lauderdale, and he was also eliminated. So, at this point, the disappearance was a cold case. They had no leads on these girls. They didn't know who they were with, where they were, what car they were in. The case went cold. Aside from these two girls, while the case is cold, I have to move this chair. I'm so sorry. It sounds really weird. Okay. While this case has gone cold, I will tell you about the suspected... How do I say this properly? I guess some more suspected murders of Gerard Schaefer. He was not charged with these, but very suspicious circumstances, very similar to Susan and Georgia. A girl by the name of Mary Alice Briscolina, who was only 14 years old, and her friend, Elsie Lena Farmer, 13 years old, disappeared while hitchhiking. They were hitchhiking to a restaurant from a motel in Fort Lauderdale on October 26, 1972, which is literally less than a month after Susan and Georgia were last seen. Their bodies were recovered separately in an undergrowth area close to Sunrise Boulevard, which is a little bit outside of the city of Plantation, Florida. Both of the bodies were found with their legs spread apart, which was weird. It was not like a natural way for the bodies to be laying. Briscolina had been She had been beaten extensively around her head, and one blow to the skull was fatal, so she had been extensively beaten. Several of her fingernails had been torn from her body, which indicated she had been in a struggle for her life with her killer. She had fought to the very end. Farmer had also been bludgeoned to death. Both of these women, young ladies. Obviously, the families and the friends of these girls were questioned, and it was revealed that Mary Alice and Elsie frequently visited this apartment at a complex known as Lauderdale by the Sea. The person responsible for renting this apartment was the older sister of Mary Alice's boyfriend. Apparently, an individual that knew her older sister, or knew her boyfriend and his older sister, was named Gary Shepherd, and he had met Mary Alice Bruscolino. This person, who was later identified as Schaefer, had also claimed to be an ex-Wilton Manors police officer, just like Gerard. 3 months later, after the death of these girls, on January 11th, 1973, more hitchhikers, both 19-year-old girls by the name of Colette Marie Goodenough and Barbara Ann Wilcox, disappeared while, wait for it, hitchhiking. They were going from Sioux City, Iowa to Florida. Both of these girls were last seen alive in Biloxi, Mississippi. Their disappearance, like the other girls, occurred while Gerard was a free man before his trial started. The reason that he is suspected of the disappearance of these girls is because he made a long-distance phone call from Cedar Rapids, Iowa, to Florida shortly before Goodenough and Wilcox's disappearance. Therefore, it's very possible he could have encountered these girls while he was returning to Florida. It's also not known why he was in Iowa and not in Florida to begin with. The girls, their skeletal remains were found scattered, and they were close to a large tree and an orange crate in January of 1977, 4 years later. Both victims had been bound together with wire, and there were impressions on the tree branches that indicated one or both of them had been suspended from the tree as their murderer sat on the orange crate and watched. Back to 1972, December to be exact, Gerard appeared in court for the Trotter and Wells abductions. His attorney implored him to take the plea deal because, his attorney knew this was absolutely ridiculous. Like, you can't do this shit. So, because of the plea deal, he was able to plead guilty to just one charge of aggravated assault. He received a sentence of 1 year in jail, with the possibility of parole after only 6 months, and then 3 years of probation. That is insane to me. When the judge gave him his sentence on December 22nd, 1972, the judge said, "It is beyond the court's imagination to conceive how you were such a foolish and astronomic jackass as you were in this case." According to Gerard, when he left the courtroom, he told several reporters, "I made a stupid mistake. There was no sex involved. No one was hurt." Physically, were they hurt? Maybe minorly. But the emotional damage this did alone, it's insane. Now, back to the cold case we talked about earlier. The following year, in March of 1973, Lucille Place discovered a letter in her daughter's bedroom that was written by a man named Gerard Schaefer. She saw the return address on the letter, 333 Martin Avenue in Stuart, Florida. She drove there because, like I said, her daughter's been missing for months. This is the last person that saw her alive. When she gets to the apartment building, she learns that Gerard Schaefer did not exist and that he was registered at the property under the name Gerard Schaefer, and that he was recently sent to jail for the abduction and attempted hanging of 2 girls. Lucille realized while she was driving around that she had incorrectly noted the license plate number because she believed he was from the county they lived in. And back in the day, this was not universal. In Martin County, which is where Gerard was from, tags began with 4-2. And in the county she lived in, it only began with a 4. So she said, oh, I need to call them. I need to sort this out and make sure that they took it down properly. When she calls them and gives them this information, they had properly written it down. And when they ran the new tag number, they found it was indeed the car, and it was indeed registered to Gerard Schaefer. They brought him in for questioning. Well, they didn't bring him in. He was already in jail. They questioned him. He denied having ever met this woman or her child, who is missing, as we know. Even though, before they even questioned Gerard, Lucille positively identified a Wilton Manors photograph of Gerard Schaefer as Jerry Shepard. Following, on the afternoon of April 1st, a father and son were searching for aluminum cans just around to recycle them for money. And they discovered the decomposed remains of 2 individuals. The remains were scattered within a hole that was dug between some trees in Oak Hammock Park, Port St. Lucie, Florida. The location was about 200 feet from the nearest road, and the grave itself was only 2 feet wide and 3 inches deep. The tree next to the makeshift gravesite had deep scratch marks on the base of the tree. And this part grosses me out, so I apologize in advance, but if you're not new here, you know we talk about some weird shit. On this tree, where the scratch marks were, sections of a torso had been bound to the base of the trunk. One of the victims still had on what was left of a pair of blue jeans, and the other one was completely naked. There was a pile of clothes that belonged to both of these victims in a nearby area full of undergrowth, so it was kind of hidden. Sections of both bodies had been dismembered, not by the murderer, but by animals. And they were scattered around the area. The location of these bodies was only 6 miles from where Nancy Trotter and Sue Wells had been held captive before they escaped from Gerard Schaefer. Both of these victims, both girls, had been bound and murdered. Their spinal cords were severed at the lumbar and cervical sections, and several of their bones had been completely severed with a knife or machete, not by animals. Their bodies had been decapitated after death, and their jawbones had numerous fractures. One set of remains was later identified as Place, and she had a gunshot wound to her lower jaw, inflicted by a .22 caliber pistol. Sections of tree bark of another nearby tree, about 9 feet from the grave, showed that one or both girls had been suspended from this tree long enough to leave impressions in the bark prior to their death. That's how long they had been hanging. The initials GJ had been carved into a tree trunk, and the roots of this tree had several deep knife incisions and clothing fibers, like someone had just started hacking at this tree. The bodies were taken to the medical examiner, and they were identified by dental records and healed bone fractures as Place and Jessup, the 16 and 17-year-old girls that were last seen with Jerry Shepard. Gerard was informed, while in jail, of the identifications of his bodies and where they were found, and he immediately requests an attorney. A public defender, because he cannot afford an attorney. The location and their identities, plus the similarities in the abduction and just the weird shit, obviously led them to Schaefer. They were already convinced that he did it, which is not surprising because he was not very smart about it. They got a search warrant for both his house and his car, and the home of his mother. And Lucille Place, once again, formally identified Gerard Schaefer as being the man that she had last seen with her daughter and Georgia Jessup. 2 counties had search warrants to search his house. First, I will talk about what was found by the Broward County Police Department. When they arrived at Gerard's mother's house in Fort Lauderdale, they found a locked bedroom. Inside the locked bedroom, they found 300 pages of exotic, creepy-ass stories. These were written or typed by Gerard Schaefer over the course of several years. All of these stories were about kidnapping, raping, executing, hanging teenage girls and young women, and he would refer to them as whores, sluts, harlots. You can imagine. 2 women in these stories are named Belinda and Carmen. He also wrote about an unidentified woman who he graphically describes hanging at an unknown location, but he describes it as being close to Powerline Road. In these stories, Gerard is the main character here. And in a lot of these stories, he writes that he forced his victims to drink either beer or wine to obviously get tipsy. And then he made them stand on like a little makeshift plinth with a noose around their neck so that he could watch them essentially pee on themselves before they were hung to death. Or I guess the correct term is hanged to death, but that just sounds grammatically incorrect, so I'm very sorry. According to the stories, he had often returned back to the crime scenes weeks or months after the murders to commit acts of necrophilia with both buried and dismembered bodies, and then he would extract teeth from the skull. His writings also revealed that he was absolutely obsessed with very historical methods of torture and execution, which is why he was obsessed with hanging. He was also obsessed with watching distressed women urinate on themselves before hanging. Don't know why. Also found at his mother's house, they found 11 guns, multiple bags filled with live and spent cartridges, 13 hunting knives, which he did like to hunt, but this is still strange, sections of rope, and pornographic magazines, which he had drawn on to show nude urinating women bound with ropes and hanging from trees or makeshift gallows. Some women were drawn with bullet wounds. They also recovered 37 Polaroid photographs of women being hung or mutilated, typically within undergrowth thickets that were suspected to be in Davie, Florida, by the way that it looked, which is in Broward County. The way that the photos were focused, it was pretty much impossible to identify anyone in these photos. They found more photographs that showed Schaefer dressed in female clothing, simulating his own hanging from a tree, with fecal matter smeared across his butt. They also found, on top of these very graphic photos, a letter that was dated July 20th, 1971, and it came from Victoria, Australia. The person who sent the letter was someone that Gerard had become acquainted with as they traveled in Morocco in the summer of 1970 before he became a police officer. In the letter that they found, there were also several Polaroid images, and they were labeled as a village in the Sahara that they had supposedly encountered together. village in the Sahara, these photos, were a massacre of both Europeans and Arabs. Several of these Polaroids showed women who had been disemboweled and absolutely mutilated with knives and axes. Inside of a jewelry box at Gerard's mother's home, they saw personal possessions that obviously did not belong to Gerard or his mother. They found jewelry, passports, and clothing that belonged to several teenage girls and young women. Some of these items they were able to successfully identify as belonging to missing or murdered women. There was a heart-shaped charm that was inscribed with the initials MTN. There was a locket inscribed with the name Lee. Lee had been a neighbor of Gerard's when they were both teenagers, and she had been missing since September of 1969. They also recovered a driver's license that belonged to Barbara Ann Wilcox and a passport that belonged to Colette Marie Goodenough. Both girls, who I told you, were reported missing in January of 1973. Later, both teeth and sections of bones were identified as belonging to at least 8 victims, and they were also recovered from this property. On top of all of these crazy findings, Martin County still had a search warrant as well. In Martin County, they searched Gerard's home on April 6th. They did not get quite as much physical evidence as what they found from his mother's home. However, they did recover 2 human teeth that were in a plastic capsule inside of his bedroom, several knives and firearms, and an extensively blood-stained white pillowcase, which had clearly been washed multiple times, but you can't wash out blood on a white pillowcase. Georgia Jessup had a very easily identifiable suede purse, and they discovered that Gerard's wife was in possession of this purse, and she told police that her husband had given her this item as a gift in about November of the previous year. Apparently, Gerard had reached out to his wife and had tried to get her and his brother-in-law, her brother, to discard the item, get rid of it, after he learned that they had found these bodies in Oak Hammock Park. He told them that the police may use this to make up some kind of evidence against him, which is already suspicious. I don't know why his wife is still married to him. But however, they gave the item to the police. They did not just throw away this gift because they thought he was being insane. So they gave it to the police. It did not belong to his wife. It belonged to Georgia Jessup. On May 12th, they had enough physical and circumstantial evidence to link Gerard to 9 murders and unsolved disappearances from anywhere between 1969 and 1973. This same month, a newspaper article published a list of 28 murdered or missing individuals that could be linked to Gerard Schaefer. The majority of these people were from Florida, obviously, but 2 of them were from Iowa and West Virginia. At a press conference on May 14th, the chief investigator, Lem Brumley Jr., informed the media that, in terms of scope and bizarreness, this case was the biggest he had encountered in his career to date. Which I agree. I don't know what other cases that he was dealt in his lifetime, but this case is so insane. And I had actually never heard anything about this case until a friend of mine recommended me to look into it. I had heard of the killer cop, but I had never actually heard of what he did. On May 18th, Gerard was formally charged with first-degree murder for the killings of both Place and Jessup. He was held without bond pending his trial. And he was transferred to the Florida State Hospital to undergo 30 days of psychiatric examinations before he was returned to St. Lucie County Jail on June 20th. The results of these exams proved that Gerard was suffering from paranoia, psychosis, and sexual deviation, and he viewed himself as an eliminator of women that he deemed immoral. Nonetheless, they said he was mentally competent to stand trial. He was just fucked up. At a circuit court hearing, June 21st, a day after he was transferred back to the jail, the district attorney successfully argued before the judge that Gerard was sane and could stand trial. Gerard, once again, claimed he was 100% innocent, this was a mistake, and he was confident that he would be released on these charges, that they didn't stand a chance, which is, once again, absolutely insane to me. A couple months later, his trial began on September 17th, 1973, and he was tried in St. Lucie County. At this time, the murders of both Place and Jessup had been committed while the Supreme Court of Florida had already declared that the death penalty was unconstitutional. So, at this point, the prosecutors were looking for a life sentence for Gerard. He, like I said, pleaded not guilty. He was not interested in a plea deal because he was adamant that he was innocent. Throughout the proceedings, he seemed elsewhere. He was distant. He was cold. He was, uninterested in this. He did testify at the pretrial hearing to say, yes, I'm innocent. This is ridiculous. However, during the actual trial, he would not testify. They had multiple witnesses testify, including Place's parents, Lucille Place, and her husband. They testified about how they met, supposedly Gerard Schaefer, but it was Gerard Schaefer. Talked about the last time they saw the girls. They brought in the county clerk to talk about how his vehicle was registered to his address and that Lucille Place had the correct tag. They brought in the medical examiner to talk about how the victims were restrained prior to their murders and how they were dismembered. Nancy Trotter and Paula Wells also testified. Also, earlier, I'm pretty sure I called her Sue Wells because I mixed up Sue Place and Paula Wells, so forgive me for that. But Nancy Trotter and Paula Wells also testified about their crazy-ass abduction and their escape. Besides the physical evidence and the witnesses, they also brought in the actual tree limbs where the victims had been suspended to show how long they had been suspended by these trees. They saw the tree roots where they had to stand, and I'm gonna look up a picture of these trees, and I will post them on the Daily Kaylee Facebook page so that you all can see how awful this was. I know that when you're hearing it, you're not thinking, okay, wow, the trees had marks. But when you see the marks on these trees, you will, understand how long that rope had been pulling on the tree. The main strategy of Gerard's defense was to discredit the witness testimony. They weren't necessarily trying to dismiss that any of this has happened, but they were trying to dismiss that they had identified Gerard Schaefer. They were trying to discredit their identification and make it seem like they had the wrong man. They also tried to say that one or both of the girls had been alive after September 27th. And that supposedly the gravesite had been dug after Gerard had already been serving his sentence in Martin County Jail. Gerard's wife and his sister both testified about how his physical characteristics and his clothes were different from the ones that were described by Sue Place's mom. All kinds of crazy shit. I don't know. There's nothing really even worth noting from his defense because it was all bullshit and it was not very strong at all. He was finally convicted. The jury deliberated for 5 hours and 10 minutes, and they returned that he was guilty of first-degree murder in both cases. Once he spoke to reporters after receiving the verdict, Gerard was still out of it. I mean, he was still claiming he was innocent. And he said to reporters, "That's the roll of the dice. I had a good defense. I'm innocent." Place's mother, Lucille Place, expressed her satisfaction that he was sentenced to life. She didn't really mind that he couldn't receive the death penalty. She said to reporters, "At first, I thought I'd like to see him dead, but I think people suffer more with confinement. Death is the easy way out, just as long as he's never on the streets again." And I think that sums it up nicely. Here's a little update on the Gerard Schaefer case. Well, I won't say this is the update because this was determined during the trial. But because of the statutes in Florida, he had the possibility, maybe, of parole after he had served between 14 and 19 years. However, in 1979, they indicated that he would not likely be eligible until maybe 2016. He appealed his conviction multiple times, rejected every time. As I'm sure you know, he may have been eligible for parole in 2016, but he was not released because he died 21 years earlier. On December 3rd, 1995, he was stabbed to death on the floor of his cell. He had been stabbed over 40 times to the face, head, neck, and body, and his throat was also slashed. During the stabbing, his right eye was completely destroyed and several of his ribs were fractured. A fellow inmate was convicted of his murder, and he received 53 years and 10 months imprisonment added to his life sentence. So, I mean, truly he had nothing to lose. At the time of his death, Broward County investigators were in the process of bringing further murder charges to the light to ensure that he would never be freed from prison. He would never be eligible for parole. And, well, I mean, it may not have worked out. They didn't solve the case, but they got justice. The list that was published in the newspaper article of the 28 possible victims, I won't talk about that today because we are almost at an hour, and I know a lot of you probably don't have an hour to sit here and listen to me, but I will post this list on the Daily Kaylee Facebook page, and you are welcome to look at it, do your research. If you do look at this list, tell me what you think. Tell me if you think, based on the evidence that I will give you, if he committed these murders. Obviously, we don't know for sure. We never will. But tell me what you believe. As always, thank you guys so much for listening to me. It's always fun sitting down for an hour or so and just chatting with you guys like we're best friends. And I'm so excited for more 13 Days of Halloween. Thank you guys for listening. Bye, guys.